The coffee cup hit the floor and shattered into pieces. A woman gasped. Two men at the counter slid off their stools and backed toward the door without knowing why they were doing it. It was instinct, the kind of instinct that fires when something in the room changes and the air itself tells you to pay attention. Behind the broken cup stood an old man. His coat was buttoned wrong, one side hanging lower than the other. His shoes did not match, one brown, one black, both old. His hands were shaking at his sides. His face was the face of a man who had walked through something and had not yet figured out what it was. In front of him sat a wall of leather and muscle. The patch on the back read Hell's Angels. Tattoos crawled up a thick neck and disappeared into a black beard that hung to the man's chest. Arms like fence posts. Shoulders that barely fit inside the booth. He turned on his stool, slow the way a man turns when he already knows something is coming, and he has decided not to hurry. Cold eyes, no expression. Waiting. The old man opened his mouth. His lips moved once, then stopped. The whole diner went dead still. The cook leaned through the kitchen window. The waitress froze behind the counter with a coffee pot in her hand. The young couple in the corner booth stopped chewing. Nobody moved. Then the old man said 7 words. 7 words that nobody in that room expected to hear. 7 words that landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. His name was Harold. He was 81 years old. And what happened in the next 24 hours would change the life of a Hell's Angel named Mason Rourke in ways that neither of them would ever be able to fully explain. Stay with me on this one. The diner was called Murphy's. It had been on the corner of Elm and 7th in Tucson, Arizona since 1962. Red vinyl booths, black and white floor tiles worn smooth in the middle from 60 years of foot traffic. A long counter with chrome stools, most of them patched with electrical tape. A coffee pot that was always full, and a pie case that was never empty. Harold Briggs and Eleanor Briggs had sat in the same booth every Saturday morning for 53 years. Booth number 4, by the window, where the morning light came through the glass at just the right angle and turned everything gold for about 40 minutes, starting at 8:15. Eleanor used to say that was the best 40 minutes of the week. Harold used to pretend he thought she was being dramatic. He knew she was right. That morning, Eleanor was gone. She had passed in her sleep just after 5 in the morning. Harold had woken up at 5:32 the way he always woke up without an alarm, the same time for 50 years of mornings. He had reached across the bed the way he always reached across the bed. And he had known the moment his hand touched hers. He did not call anyone. He did not get up right away. He lay there for a few minutes with his hand over hers, looking at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house. Then he sat up. He sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at her face. She looked like she was sleeping. She always looked like she was sleeping when she was asleep. He had watched her sleep 10,000 times in 53 years. This was the 10,001st time, and it was nothing like any of the others. He sat with her for a long time. The sun came up, the room filled with light. He watched the shadows on the wall change shape as the morning moved. He held her hand. He did not cry. He did not know yet how to cry about this. It did not feel like something you could cry about. It felt like something much larger than that. It felt like the ground under him had shifted and he was still standing there trying to figure out which direction was north. After a while, he stood up. He went to the closet. He pulled out his gray coat, the old one with the deep pockets, the one Eleanor had bought him for his 75th birthday, and said made him look distinguished. He put it on. He buttoned it without looking at it. He went to the shoe rack and put on the first 2 shoes he reached. He did not look at them either. He walked out of the bedroom. He walked past Eleanor's pink slippers sitting beside the door where she had left them the night before. He walked past the kitchen where her reading glasses were folded on top of the crossword puzzle she had been working on yesterday afternoon. He walked past the photographs on the wall, 53 years of them, their whole life hung up in frames, and he did not look at any of it. He picked up his keys. He drove the same route he had driven every Saturday morning for 53 years. Down Elm Street, past the church on the corner of Elm and Madison, where he and Eleanor had been married in June of 1973. Past Tucson High School, where both of his kids had gone. past the old Texaco station on 5th that had been a cell phone repair shop for the last 12 years, but that he still thought of as the Texaco. He parked in the same spot he always parked in, the spot on the north side of the lot, under the edge of the awning. He walked to the door. The bell above it jingled when he pushed it open. The woman behind the counter was named Bev. Beverly Marsh, though nobody had called her that since her mother died. She had worked at Murphy's for 30 years. She had white hair she kept pinned up and a voice that could cut through the noise of a full diner at Sunday brunch, and she had known Harold and Eleanor Briggs since before their kids were grown. She saw Harold come through the door, and she started to smile the way she always smiled when she saw them on Saturday mornings. Then she saw his face. Then she saw his coat. Then she saw his shoes, one brown, one black. Her smile stopped. She saw his eyes, and she understood in the way that people who have worked a long time around human beings understand things without being told them. She set down the coffee pot. She started to come around the counter. She was going to say something. She was going to say his name and take his arm and tell him softly that the booth was occupied this morning. She would find him another seat, just come with her. But Harold was already walking. He walked the way he always walked to booth number 4. Straight line, slight lean forward. The walk of a man who has been going to the same place for so long that his body just goes without being asked. He did not see the other customers. He did not see Bev's face. He did not see the 2 truckers at the counter go quiet or the young couple in the corner stop talking. He saw the booth, and he saw the man sitting in it. Mason Rourke had walked into Murphy's 22 minutes earlier. He had come off I-10 after a long ride from Flagstaff, and he had wanted coffee and eggs and a place to sit that was not moving. He had not come in looking for anything else. He had taken booth number 4 because it was the only booth open. He had no idea what that booth meant. He was 44 years old, 6'3", 260 pounds of it, most of that in his chest and shoulders. Black beard long, going slightly gray at the corners. A bandana around his head. A leather vest with patches sewn tight, and on the back the death's head, the wings. The words that meant something to the people who wore them and something different to everyone else. His hands were wrapped around a coffee cup. He had eaten half his eggs. He had his eyes on the window on the parking lot, on nothing in particular. The way a man looks when he is used to being alone with his thoughts, and he has made his peace with that. Then he felt something change in the room. He had been in enough rooms in his life to know when something changed. He turned on his stool slow, and he looked at the old man walking toward him. He took in everything at once the way he took in everything. The coat, the shoes, the hands, the face, most of all the face. He had a long experience with faces and what they carried and what they were trying not to show. The face of the old man coming toward him was not trying to hide anything. It was past that. It was the face of a man who had walked into something so large that there was no point in pretending it was smaller than it was. Harold stopped in front of booth number 4. He looked at the man sitting in it. He looked at the empty seat across from him, the seat by the window, the seat where the morning light would be gold in about 20 minutes. He looked at the window itself. He stood there for a moment that was longer than it looked. Then he looked at Mason Rourke, and he said 7 words. "My wife passed away today. Can I sit?" The whole diner heard it. Mason did not move for a long moment. His face did not change. He looked at the old man standing in front of him in the wrong shoes, with the shaking hands and the coat button crooked, and the eyes that had already been through something no one should have to go through alone. He looked at him the way he looked at things he was deciding about. Then he reached over and put his big hand flat on the empty seat across from him. "Sit down, old-timer." Harold sat. He moved into the booth slowly the way a man moves when he is not entirely sure his body will do what he asks of it. He pulled himself in inch by inch. He put both hands flat on the table. They were still shaking. They kept shaking. He looked down at them like they belonged to someone else. Bev came over. She did not ask what they wanted. She did not say anything at all. She put a fresh cup in front of Harold, and she refilled Mason's cup, and she set cream and sugar between them. She looked at Harold's face for 1 second, and then she looked away because there are some things you do not stare at. She walked back to the counter without a word. The diner moved again. Quiet, careful, everyone pretending not to watch. Harold wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He needed something to hold. The cup was warm and solid, and it was something. His wedding ring caught the morning light coming through the window. Gold, thin, worn smooth and flat by 53 years on the same finger. He had put it on in June of 1973 in a small church 2 miles from where he was sitting right now, and he had not taken it off since. Mason noticed it. He noticed everything. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that two people fall into when words have not yet caught up to what is happening. Mason drank his coffee. Harold held his. Outside on Elm Street, a delivery truck went past. Somewhere in the kitchen, something sizzled on the griddle. Then Mason said, "What was her name?" His voice was deep, low, the kind of voice that did not need to be loud to carry. He asked it the way you ask a question that matters carefully, like he was handling something he did not want to drop. Harold swallowed. "Eleanor," he said. "Eleanor Ann Briggs." Mason nodded once, slow, like he was committing it to memory. "How long?" Harold looked at his ring. 53 years next month. Mason was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me about her." And Harold did. He started with the library, the Bridgeport Public Library in Connecticut, the fall of 1971. He had just gotten home from 4 years in the Navy. He was 24 years old, and he did not know what he was going to do with the rest of his life, but he thought maybe he should start by reading some books. He walked through the door on a Tuesday afternoon, and there she was. She was carrying too many books. That was the first thing he noticed. She had a stack of them up to her chin, more than any reasonable person would try to carry at one time, and she was trying to manage the door with her elbow and losing. He got to her just as the stack went. They both bent down. Their hands landed on the same book at the same time. Pride and Prejudice. She looked up at him through a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. She had dark hair pulled back a yellow cardigan ink on her left index finger. She smiled like she was apologizing and laughing at the same time. That was it. That was the whole story, beginning to end in one moment on the floor of a public library in Connecticut in 1971. He married her 18 months later. Her father had not been enthusiastic. Her father was a man who kept a careful ledger of who was worth what. And Harold at 25 was a working man with calloused hands and no degree and no clear prospects. And in her father's ledger, that did not add up to much. Harold spent the next decade proving the ledger wrong. He learned the construction trade from the ground up. He started his own small company, Briggs Construction, out of a truck and a phone and whatever jobs he could get. He built houses. He built commercial spaces. He built the house he and Eleanor lived in for the next 40 years on a quiet street in Tucson, with 2 big maple trees in the front yard, and a porch swing and a flower bed along the front walk that Eleanor planted herself and tended every spring. They had 2 children. Garrett was born in 1975. He was a high school history teacher now in Sacramento. He had 2 kids of his own, a boy and a girl, and he called his father every Sunday afternoon, which was more than Harold had called his own father, and Harold knew it and appreciated it more than he ever said. Nora came in 1978. She was a registered nurse in Portland, 3 kids, a husband who fixed airplanes for a living. She had her mother's dark hair and her mother's way of tilting her head when she was listening to something she found interesting. She had her father's stubbornness, which Eleanor used to point out with great satisfaction, as if she had always known it would turn out that way. Both of them lived far away. Both of them had lives that took up all the space lives take up. Harold did not blame them for it. He and Eleanor had built something good here, and it was enough. For a long time, it had been more than enough. Eleanor got sick in October. He told Mason about that part quietly. Stage 4. The doctor had said it plainly, the way good doctors do, without softening it so much that you miss what he is saying. 8 months, maybe a little more. Eleanor had taken off her glasses, polished them with the hem of her sweater, put them back on and said, "Well, we'd better make them good ones." They had tried. The last 8 months had not been easy, but they had been real and they had been full, and there had been more good days than Harold had any right to expect. She had sat in her chair by the window and read. She had done the crossword puzzle every afternoon in pen the way she always had. She had watched the birds at the feeder Harold hung outside the kitchen window. She had held his hand a lot. She had laughed a lot. She had been right up to the last weeks unmistakably herself. She had gone in her sleep, quietly, without struggle. Harold had held her hand in the morning, and she was already cold, and he had sat with her in the light coming through the window, and he had not called anyone. And then he had come here. Mason listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not offer anything while Harold was talking. He did not check his phone or look at the door or shift in his seat. He just listened with his whole body the way that some people can listen completely and without reservation, like the listening itself was a thing you gave another person when you had nothing else to give. When Harold's voice cracked, Mason slid the napkin dispenser a few inches closer across the table. He did not say anything. He just moved it closer. Harold took a napkin, wiped his eyes, kept talking. He talked about the way Eleanor laughed, which started quiet, and then became something she had no control over. A full laugh that involved her whole face and sometimes her whole body, and it was the best sound Harold had ever heard in his life, and he had heard it 10,000 times, and it never got smaller. He talked about how she hummed when she folded laundry, never the same song twice, always something she had just heard or just thought of. He talked about how she always saved the corner pieces of brownies for him because she knew he liked the edges. He talked about how she put her cold feet on his back in bed every winter night for 53 winters, and he would flinch and say Eleanor, and she would laugh into her pillow, and they both knew he didn't mean it. He pulled out his wallet. His hands were shaking again. He opened it slowly. He reached into the back where the leather was worn thin and soft. He pulled out a photograph small the size of a library card, the edges rounded and soft from being carried a long time. He slid it across the table. It was their wedding day, June 1973. Eleanor in white simple dress, flowers in her hair. Harold in a borrowed suit, a little too big in the shoulders, a little too short in the legs. Both of them young. Both of them grinning the way people grin when they have just done something they know is right. Mason picked it up. His big hand, all knuckles and ink, made the little photograph look smaller than it was. He held it with 2 fingers at the corners carefully, the way you hold something you understand the value of. He looked at it for a long time. "She's beautiful, sir," he said. Harold's eyes filled. "She was the best person I ever knew," he said. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I don't know how to be a person without her." Mason set the photograph down on the table soft. He kept one finger at the edge of it for just a moment, like he was making sure Harold got it back safe. Then he took his hand away. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What did she like to eat here?" Harold blinked. "I'm sorry. Here at Murphy's. What did she order?" Harold looked at him. Then something shifted in his face, some small thing, some door opening, just a crack. "The mushroom omelet," he said. "Wheat toast. And a small orange juice. She always said the large was too much, but she always drank mine when she finished hers." Mason raised 2 fingers. Bev was there inside of 10 seconds like she had been waiting. "2 mushroom omelets," Mason said. "Wheat toast, 2 small orange juices. And keep the coffee coming." Bev wrote it down. She looked at Harold. He nodded once, very small, and she walked away. When the food came, Harold looked at the omelet for a long time without picking up his fork. Mason did not push him. He ate his own food slowly, without hurry, looking out the window at the street. He gave Harold the space to do what he needed to do. That was something Mason knew how to do. He had learned it a long time ago, the value of being in a place without demanding anything from it. After a while, Harold picked up his fork. He took one small bite, then another. Then he was eating, and he was crying. At the same time, not dramatically, not loudly, just tears moving down his old face in the morning light. And he kept eating anyway because the food was there, and someone had ordered it for him. and somehow that meant something he could not put into words. Mason watched him for a moment, then he looked back out the window. When the plates were empty, Bev refilled their coffee without being asked. Mason leaned back against the booth. He looked out at Elm Street, at the morning light on the pavement, at a woman walking a dog past the window. Then he said, "My grandmother raised me." Harold looked up. "Pearl Rourke," Mason said. "She took me in when I was 3. My mother was gone by then. My father was never really there to begin with. Pearl was it. She was everything." He turned the coffee cup in his hand slowly. "She died when I was 19. I came home from a job at a junkyard over in Flagstaff. I was working there that summer, moving scrap, doing whatever they needed. I came home and I found her in her chair, just sitting there like she was asleep." He paused. "I sat with her for a long time. I don't know how long. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there. Uma ushachim." His voice did not waver. It stayed low, even like water running over flat rock. But something moved behind his eyes, something that had been there a long time and had learned to stay where it was. "That look you came in here with," Mason said, "when you were standing in front of this booth." He looked at Harold directly. "I know that look. I wore that look for a long time." Harold could not speak. He sat very still. Mason looked back at his coffee. "People look at me," he said, "and they see what they see. That's fine. I'm used to it. But my grandmother never saw any of that. She called me Mikey, right up to the end. Every phone call, every time she saw me, no matter what I looked like or what I was doing. Mikey." He said the name quietly, like he was picking something up that he had set down somewhere a long time ago and was not sure he still had the right to hold. "Nobody's called me that since." Harold reached across the table. He put his old hand on Mason's arm, his thin, spotted, shaking hand on the tattooed forearm of a Hell's Angel 40 years younger than him. He did not say anything. He just put his hand there and left it. Mason looked down at it. He did not move. They sat like that for a long moment. Two men in a booth at Murphy's Diner on a Saturday morning in Tucson, Arizona, the coffee warm in their cups, the morning light coming through the window at booth number 4 and spreading gold across the table between them. Then Bev came by with the check, and Mason waved it off and dropped a stack of bills on the table. More than enough, considerably, more than enough, and he stood up. "Let me walk you to your car," he said. Harold nodded. He began the slow process of getting out of the booth. Mason waited without impatience, without offering help until it was needed, and then he offered it simply, one hand extended, no commentary. They walked out of Murphy's together. The bell above the door jingled behind them. Bev watched them go. She stood behind the counter with the coffee pot in her hand, and she did not move for a moment. Her eyes were wet. She had worked at Murphy's for 30 years, and she had seen a lot of things happen in that diner, and she thought she would remember this one for the rest of her life. The parking lot was quiet in the late morning sun. Harold's truck was where he always parked it, on the north side under the awning. It was a white Ford, 20 years old, kept clean. Eleanor's rosary hung from the rearview mirror, blue glass beads, a small silver cross. It had hung there for 11 years since the day she put it up, and Harold had never touched it. 3 men were standing between Harold and his truck. They were young mid-20s, the kind of young that has gone wrong somewhere and knows it. One of them was heavy with restless energy, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he could not stop moving. One had a tattoo across his jaw. The third one, the one who stepped forward, was holding a folding knife at his side, open the blade catching the sun. They had been watching the diner from across the street. They had seen Harold come in, an old man alone with wrong shoes and a coat buttoned wrong. They had waited. They had not expected him to come out walking next to something like Mason Rourke, but they were already committed. "Hey, old-timer," the one with the knife said. "Wallet." Harold froze. His knees went soft. He grabbed the side mirror of the nearest car to keep from going down. Mason stepped between them. He moved without hurry. He put himself directly in front of Harold, and he stood there, and he looked at the man with the knife, the way you look at something you have already made a decision about. "Walk away," Mason said. The man with the knife laughed. It was a short laugh, not a real one. Old man owes us a tax. He doesn't owe you anything. Walk away. The one who could not stop moving came in fast from the left side. He hit Harold in the shoulder hard as shove with both hands. Harold went down. He went down sideways, and his hip hit the asphalt, and his glasses came off, and he heard something crack, either his hearing aid or the glasses frame, and the ground was hot from the morning sun and very hard, and he could not get up. Mason's eyes changed. Harold saw it from the ground. He saw the moment something turned over in Mason's chest, something that had been still and was now moving. Mason did not yell. He did not posture. He did not give any more warnings. He moved. The one who could not stop moving went first. One strike open hand to the throat. The man folded forward and went down on his knees and stayed there. The man with the knife slashed. Mason caught the wrist with both hands, turned it at an angle it was not meant to go, and the knife hit the asphalt. He took the man down face first and put his knee in the center of his back and held him there with one hand while the man made sounds that were not words. The third one ran. He made it 11 steps. Mason caught him by the back of the collar, turned him around, and walked him backward 3 steps and set him down hard on the trunk of a car. He stood over him. He was breathing normally. "Get up," he said. "Get your friends and get out of this parking lot and do not come back." The third one got up. He was shaking. He grabbed the one who had been on his knees and dragged him toward a brown Buick parked on the far side of the lot. The one with the knife crawled after them, blood on his face from the asphalt. Mason did not watch them go. He turned and crouched down next to Harold on the ground. His voice dropped completely. "You okay, sir?" Harold blinked up at him. The sun was very bright. "I think so," he said. "I'm not sure." Mason got his arm under Harold's shoulders. He helped him up with a steadiness that made it feel easy, that made Harold feel like he weighed nothing. He walked him to the truck. He opened the passenger side door. He helped Harold in with one hand behind his back and one hand under his arm, slow and careful, and he set him on the seat like he was setting down something that mattered. He picked up Harold's glasses from the asphalt. The left lens was cracked through, but the frame was intact. He put them in Harold's hand and closed Harold's fingers around them. Then he looked at Harold directly. "Hey, look at me." Harold looked at him. You're all right. Eleanor's looking down at you right now, and she's saying, you're all right. You hear me?" Harold's eyes filled. He could not speak. He just nodded, very small, and pressed his cracked glasses against his chest. Mason shut the passenger door gently. He walked around to the driver's side. He looked across the parking lot as he did. The brown Buick was still sitting where it had been. The engine was not running. Someone in the passenger seat had a phone up to his ear and was talking fast and pointing in the direction of Harold's truck. Mason got in. He started the engine. He reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out his phone. He held the steering wheel with one knee while he sent 2 text messages. One went to a man named Diesel. One went to a man named Crow. Both messages were the same. A street address. One word. Now. He put the phone away. He looked over at Harold. Harold was sitting with his broken glasses in his lap, one hand pressed flat on his thigh to stop it shaking, looking at nothing through the windshield. He looked like a man who had come to the end of a very long road and had no idea there was more road after this. Mason pulled out of the lot. He checked the mirror. 3 cars back, a brown Buick pulled out behind them. He did not change his speed. He did not change his expression. He took the left on 7th and started toward Harold Street. "Where do you live, sir?" he said. Harold gave him the address in a voice that was not much more than a breath. Mason knew the street. He turned at the next light and drove steady and easy the way you drive when you do not want the person next to you to know there is anything to be concerned about. He checked the mirror again. The Buick was still there. Harold said without turning his head, "They followed us, didn't they?" It was not quite a question. Mason glanced at him. Harold was still looking straight ahead, but his eyes were sharp under the tiredness. Sharp the way a man's eyes are sharp when he has spent 40 years reading job sites and weather and the faces of men who owed him money. "Yes," Mason said. "How many cars?" "2 that I can see, maybe a third a ways back." Harold nodded slowly. He reached up and wrapped one hand around Eleanor's rosary hanging from the mirror, the blue glass beads, the small silver cross. He held on to it without pulling it down. "What are we going to do?" he said. Mason kept his eyes on the road. "We're going to your house," he said. "We're going to make sure the doors are locked." He paused. "And then some people I know are going to come and help us figure out the rest of it." Harold looked at him. "What kind of people?" Mason's eyes stayed on the road. The corner of his mouth moved just slightly. "The kind that show up," he said. Harold's house was at the end of Oleander Street, a quiet residential block in the older part of Tucson, where the trees were big enough to actually shade something, and the houses had been there long enough to settle into themselves. Two maple trees in the front yard, wide-trunked and old. A porch swing on the front. A flower bed along the front walk. Eleanor's flower bed planted and replanted and tended for 38 years, still blooming in the June heat with the kind of stubborn persistence that some things have when they have been loved long enough. A welcome mat in front of the door that said, "Home" in plain letters. Mason parked the Ford in the driveway. He came around to the passenger side before Harold had the door fully open and put a steady hand under his arm. Harold's hip was stiffening from the fall in the parking lot. He moved carefully, testing each step before he put his weight on it, and Mason matched his pace without comment, without impatience, one hand behind his elbow all the way up the front walk. The brown Buick rolled past on the street, slow, not stopping, just looking. Mason watched it without turning his head. He took Harold's keys, found the right one, without asking, unlocked the front door, and walked Harold inside. Eleanor's pink slippers were on the floor just inside the door, right there exactly where she had stepped out of them the night before. One slightly ahead of the other, the way they always were, the heels worn down on the outer edge from the way she walked. Soft and faded and absolutely still. Mason stopped. He stood there looking at those slippers for a long moment. Something moved across his face that he did not try to control and did not try to hide. Harold had stopped too. They were both standing in the doorway, looking at a pair of pink slippers, and neither of them could move for a few seconds. Then Mason bent down. He picked them up, one in each hand, carefully holding them by the heels. He turned to the small wooden bench beside the door, the one Eleanor used to sit on when she put her shoes on in the morning, and he set the slippers on it. Side by side, toes forward, the way she would have left them if she had meant to come back for them. He straightened up. He looked at Harold. Harold was looking at the slippers on the bench. His jaw was tight. His eyes were full. "Come on, sir," Mason said quietly. "Let's get you sitting down." He stood up and started moving through the house. He did not say anything more about it. He just moved, checking the door off the garage, throwing the deadbolt, working his way down the back hallway. The window over the utility sink locked. The small bathroom window locked, each bedroom, each latch, making sure everything was seated. He pulled curtains as he went. He came back to the living room and checked the windows on either side of the front door and drew those too. And then he went to the kitchen. He found the kettle on the back burner where it always lived. He filled it at the sink and put it on the stove. While the water heated, he stood at the kitchen window, the one over the sink, and looked out at the backyard. Eleanor's bird feeder was out there, a wooden one Harold had built himself, hanging from the arm of a metal shepherd's hook. There were birds at it. Small brown ones, a pair of them, working through the seed with efficient little movements, completely unaware that anything in the world had changed. Mason watched them for a moment. The kettle came up. He found mugs in the cabinet above the coffee maker. He found tea in the cabinet beside it, a box of the kind that comes in the yellow and red packaging that Eleanor had apparently favored because there were two boxes of it and both were half full. He made a cup and carried it to the living room and pressed it into Harold's hands. "Drink," he said. Harold drank. He held the mug with both hands and he drank slowly and he looked at the floor. Mason went back to the front window. He lifted the edge of the curtain an inch. Oleander Street was quiet in the afternoon sun. No Buick. He stood there and watched the street and listened to the sounds of the neighborhood. A lawnmower somewhere 2 blocks over, a dog, a car going past at normal speed, nothing wrong. Then headlights moved at the far end of the street. Not one set, three, then a fourth, a fifth. The low throb of engines that Harold could feel in his chest more than he could hear them. A sound like something you feel in the soles of your feet when a storm is coming. 6 motorcycles came slowly down Oleander Street and parked along the curb in front of Harold's house. They parked the way that group of men always parked, in a line, each one angled slightly, taking up the space the way they took up space with a deliberate and settled weight. 6 men got off. They wore leather vests and heavy boots, and they stood in Harold's front yard in the early afternoon light, and they did not speak. They just stood there, spaced apart, looking at the street and the neighboring houses and the approaches, looking at everything, watching. Mason went to the front door. He stepped out onto the porch. He spoke to one of them, the one who had positioned himself at the center, a man with a gray beard that came down to his belt, and a face that had taken a long time to become what it was. The man listened as Mason spoke, nodding once or twice, looking at the house, looking at the street. Then he walked up to the porch alone. He stopped at the door. He reached up and took off his bandana and held it folded in both hands. He looked at Harold through the screen door. "Sir," he said, "may I come in?" Harold nodded. The man stepped inside. He looked around the living room with a quietness that was not what Harold expected. He looked at the photographs on the wall. All of them. Harold and Eleanor on their wedding day, young and grinning, Eleanor's flowers in her hair. Their first house. Garrett as a baby, then as a boy, then in his graduation cap. Nora at 6 years old on a bicycle with training wheels, her face a picture of total concentration. Nora's wedding. Garrett's kids. Christmas mornings, vacation photos, ordinary Tuesdays caught on film and hung on a wall. A whole life, a whole long life made visible. The man looked at all of it. Then he turned to Harold. "Sir," he said. His voice was not soft exactly, but it was respectful in the way that men are respectful when they mean it and are not doing it for show. "My name is Preacher. Mason told us about your wife. We're sorry for your loss." He paused, and the pause had weight in it. "There's some trouble following you. We're going to take care of that. You don't need to think about it. We're going to sit outside tonight, and we're going to make sure nobody comes near this house. You understand?" Harold looked at him. Then he looked at Mason standing by the window. Then he looked back at Preacher. He nodded. "Mason's going to stay inside with you," Preacher said. "He's not going anywhere tonight." Harold said, "Thank you." The words came out rough, like they had been scraped across something on the way. "I don't know why you do this. You don't know me." Preacher looked at him steadily. "We know enough," he said. He started to turn toward the door. Then he stopped. He turned back. "What was her name, sir?" Harold met his eyes. "Eleanor." Preacher said it once quietly, the way you say a name when you want to make sure you have it right and intend to keep it. "Eleanor." He nodded slowly. "We'll keep her safe too." Then he walked out. Through the afternoon and into the evening, Harold sat on his couch and listened to the sounds of men outside his house. Low voices, occasional and brief. Footsteps on the porch. The creak of someone settling against the porch railing. A radio very quiet, tuned to something with no words. It was not like any sound Harold had ever associated with safety. And yet it was somehow the most protected he had felt all day. The Buick came back at 8:47 in the evening. Harold knew because he was watching the clock on the mantel, Eleanor's clock, the one with the brass face she had bought at an estate sale in 1998, and said was the best $5 she had ever spent. The Buick went past slow headlights moving across the curtain. Harold heard a low exchange of voices outside. The car kept going. It came back at 11:15. Same thing, slower this time. Harold heard boots on the front walk, heard Preacher's voice say something short and flat, and the car accelerated and did not come back for 2 hours. Harold could not sleep. He lay in the bedroom in his clothes on top of the covers, and he stared at the ceiling, and he listened to his house. He knew every sound his house made. He had built it. He had put up every wall and run every wire and laid every floor, and he knew the way it settled at night. The particular sequence of small sounds it made as the temperature dropped and the wood contracted, and he lay there and he listened to all of it, and to Eleanor's absence inside it, which was the loudest thing in the house. Around midnight, he gave up. He put on his shoes, both of them this time matching, and he shuffled out to the living room. Mason was on the couch, not sleeping. He was sitting with his arms along the back of the cushions and his eyes on the front curtain, still and alert in the way of someone who has spent a lot of time waiting in the dark and has made his peace with it. He looked at Harold when Harold came in, and he did not say anything. He just moved his arms so there was space on the couch beside him. Harold sat down. For a while they just sat there. The clock on the mantel said 12:18. Something moved on the street outside, footsteps, one of the men making a circuit. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Eleanor's bird feeder was out there in the dark, empty now, the birds long gone to wherever birds go at night. Harold said, "You can tell me to mind my own business." Mason looked at him. "Your grandmother," Harold said. "Pearl, you said you sat with her for a long time before you called anyone. What did you do after?" Mason was quiet for a moment. He looked at the curtain. "I left," he said. "I was 19 and I didn't have anyone else, and the house felt like a place I couldn't be anymore. I packed what fit in a bag. I drove east until I ran out of road." He paused. "I worked. Whatever I could find. I was big, I could move things, I could do the work nobody else wanted to do. I worked in a packing plant in New Mexico for a while, a slaughterhouse in Texas for about a month, and then I couldn't do that anymore. I worked construction for a year in Louisiana, which was where I found out I was good at it. I could have stayed with that. Why didn't you?" Mason turned the idea over slowly, the way you turn over something you have not looked at in a while and are not sure what condition you will find it in. "I kept moving," he said. "I was always going to the next place. And one night in a bar outside of Baton Rouge, I met a man named Preacher. He was about 40 then. He bought me a beer and talked to me for 3 hours about nothing in particular. And at the end of it, he said, 'You look like a man who's been moving so long he's forgotten what he's moving away from.'" Mason looked at his hands, the big scarred knuckles, the ink that went all the way to his wrists. He wasn't wrong. Harold watched him. "And that was enough to join." "It wasn't one thing," Mason said. "But yeah, he was the first person since Pearl who actually looked at me like I was a person and not a pair of hands." He was quiet for a moment. "I know what people think when they see the vest. I'm not going to tell you they're entirely wrong, but what I found with these men was the first time since I was 19 that I felt like I had somewhere to be, like somebody knew whether I showed up or not." He looked at Harold. "That matters more than people think it does, knowing that somebody's going to notice whether you show up." Harold looked at the clock. 12:41. "Eleanor noticed," he said, "every single day for 53 years. That's the thing about losing someone like that. It's not just the person you lose. It's the witness. You lose the one person who knows the whole story, who was there for all of it." He folded his hands in his lap. "I built houses for 40 years. I built 112 houses in and around Tucson. I know because I kept a list. Eleanor kept a list, actually. She wrote down every one. The address and the year and sometimes something she remembered about the family we built it for." He shook his head slowly. "I don't think I told many people that. I don't think I ever told anyone that." Mason said nothing. He looked at the curtain and sat very still. Harold reached over. He did not put his hand on Mason's arm the way he had at Murphy's. This time he rested it on the cushion between them, close enough that Mason could feel the warmth of it. Just there. Just present. Neither of them moved. They sat together until the clock said 2:15. Preacher came to the door, a quiet knock, and told them through the screen that the Buick had come. A third time stopped for 4 minutes at the end of the block, and Diesel and Crow had walked out to it from either end of the street and had a short conversation with the occupants, and the car had left and had not come back. He said it the way he said everything, plainly and without drama. And then he said he'd let them know if anything changed. They sat together until 3:30. At some point, Harold's head dropped forward, and he slept sitting up for an hour or so, which was more sleep than he had expected to get. When he woke up, Mason was in the same position, same quiet alertness, watching the curtain. The sky outside was beginning to change the black, going to the deep blue that comes just before anything else. And the first birds were starting up somewhere in the maple trees in the front yard. Harold rubbed his face. He straightened up slowly. "Mason," he said. "Sir, I need to call my children today." Mason looked at him. "I know," Harold said. "I should have done it yesterday. I couldn't." He looked at his hands in his lap. "I don't know how to say it. I've been trying to figure out how to say it since 5:30 yesterday morning and I still don't know." Mason was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You don't have to say it right. You just have to say it." Harold looked at the clock. 4:47 in the morning. "Not yet," he said. "A few more hours." "Okay." The sky went from deep blue to gray to the pale yellow that comes before the actual color of day. Bev opened Murphy's at 6 on Saturdays. Harold thought about that. He thought about Bev putting out the little plastic menus and turning over the coffee cups on the counter and unlocking the case for the pies. He thought about booth number 4 with the morning light coming through the window and nobody in it. Mason got up at 6:30 and went to the kitchen. Harold heard the refrigerator open, heard cabinets, heard the stove. After a while, he smelled eggs. He got up slowly and went to the kitchen doorway and stood there. Mason was at the stove in his black t-shirt vest, folded over the back of a chair, a kitchen towel over one shoulder. He had found the skillet in the cabinet under the stove, and the eggs in the refrigerator, and the bread on the counter, and he was scrambling eggs with the focus of a man who does not do things carelessly. He had also found Harold's good mug, the one Eleanor had given him for their 40th anniversary, dark blue, with a small chip on the handle that Harold had been meaning to address for 8 years and never had. It was sitting on the counter already filled with coffee. "Sit down, sir," Mason said without turning around. Harold sat at the kitchen table. Mason served him. Eggs toast, a glass of water. He cut up an apple he had found in the fruit bowl and put it on the side of the plate. He sat down across the table with his own plate. They ate without talking, and that was fine. The morning light came through the kitchen window and landed on the table between them, and it was quiet in the house, and outside in the maple trees, the birds were loud with morning. After breakfast, Mason did the dishes. Harold watched him do it, standing at the sink, working through the plates and the pan with a thoroughness that said he had washed dishes in places without a lot of hot water and had learned not to waste it. Then he dried his hands on the kitchen towel, came back to the table and sat down. He looked at Harold. Harold knew what was coming. He looked at the phone on the counter. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he got up and brought it to the table and set it down between them. He sat there. He picked it up. He put it back down. He picked it up again. He pulled up Garrett's number. His thumb hovered over the call button, and he sat there looking at it, and his chest was doing something that made it hard to breathe correctly. "I don't know how to say it," he said again. Mason said, "Garrett loves you. He's not going to need you to say it perfectly. He just needs to know." Harold looked at him. "You don't have to explain anything," Mason said. "You just say her name. He'll understand the rest." Harold looked back at the phone. He pressed the button. It rang twice. Garrett picked up on the second ring, which meant he had been awake, which meant some part of him already knew the way children sometimes know things, a cold feeling in the early morning that you cannot explain. His voice was already different, already careful. "Dad," Harold opened his mouth. He said, "Garrett." He said, "Your mother." And then he stopped because there was nothing after that. There was no word that came after those two things. There was just the fact of it sitting there in the silence on the line between them. Garrett made a sound that Harold had never heard his son make. Not in 50 years of knowing him. Not when he was hurt as a boy, not when he was disappointed as a young man, not at anything in his adult life. A sound that was not a word and that meant everything. Harold broke. It came apart all at once. Everything he had been holding since 5:30 the morning before, since the moment he had touched Eleanor's hand in the gray light and known. He had not cried at the diner. He had not cried when the men came to his house. He had not cried sitting on the couch next to Mason at midnight. He had held it all and carried it through the longest day and the longest night of his life, and he had managed somehow to keep moving. But hearing his son's voice break was the thing that broke him. He cried with the phone pressed against his ear and his son's broken sounds coming through it. And it was the worst thing he had ever experienced in his life. Worse than the morning before. Worse than sitting with Eleanor in the light. Because this was the moment it became real in a way that could not be undone when someone else knew it, when it was no longer only his to carry. Mason got up from the table. He walked quietly to the hallway and stood there with his back against the wall, giving Harold the privacy of the call while staying close enough to hear if something went wrong. He stood in the hallway and looked at the photographs hung there. Smaller ones, vacation photos, a young Harold in a hard hat at a job site, grinning at whoever held the camera, Eleanor in a garden somewhere, with dirt on her knees and a smile that took up her whole face. He looked at that photograph for a long time. Harold talked to Garrett for 12 minutes. Then he called Nora in Portland and talked to her for 9 minutes, which was shorter only because she cried more, and talking was harder. Both of them were getting on planes. Garrett would be there by dinner. Nora's flight was longer. She would get in around midnight. When Harold hung up, he sat at the table with the phone in both hands, and he looked at the window and the bird feeder in the morning, and he breathed. Mason came back. He sat down across from Harold, and he waited. After a while, Harold said, "They're coming." "Good," Mason said. "Both of them. I'm not going anywhere until somebody who loves you walks through that door. That's how this works." Harold looked at him for a moment. He could not argue with that. He did not try. The afternoon was quiet. Preacher came to the door at noon and said the street was clean. The Buick had not come back. He had someone keeping an eye on the neighborhood. Mason thanked him. Preacher looked at Harold and nodded once, and Harold nodded back, and that was enough. Mason walked Harold to the bedroom and suggested he lie down. Harold said he could not sleep and was unconscious in 4 minutes. He slept for 3 hours solid and deep, which was perhaps what his body had been waiting for since the previous morning and had simply not been permitted. Mason sat in the kitchen. He drank coffee. He watched Eleanor's bird feeder. The birds were back, different ones now, a small red one perched on the edge with an air of great self-importance. Mason watched it for a while. Then he took out his phone, checked arrival times for flights from Sacramento and Portland to Tucson, and put it away. Harold woke at 4:15. He came into the kitchen in his stocking feet and sat down, and Mason put coffee in front of him, and they sat together while the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor, neither of them needing to fill it with anything. Garrett arrived at 6:40. He had driven from the airport in a rental car, a gray sedan, and he pulled up in front of the house and sat in it for a moment before he got out. Harold could see him through the front window, both hands on the wheel, his head bent slightly. 49 years old. Harold's own face younger, better rested with Eleanor's eyes. He got out of the car. He came up the front walk, and Harold opened the door before he reached it, and Garrett came up the porch steps, and Harold took his son in his arms and held him. Garrett was taller than Harold now had been for 30 years, and Harold had to reach up to get his arms fully around him, and Garrett bent his head, and Harold held on. They stood like that for a long time. Then Garrett lifted his head. He looked past his father's shoulder. Mason was on the porch swing, one arm along the back of it, a glass of iced tea in his hand. The leather vest was folded on the seat beside him. He looked at Garrett steadily. Garrett looked at the vest. He looked at Mason. He looked at his father. "Dad," his voice was careful. "Who is this?" Harold stepped back. He turned and looked at Mason on the porch swing, this big, quiet man who had been there through all of it, and he said, "This is Mason. He sat with me yesterday." Garrett looked at Mason. Mason met his eyes and did not look away, and did not offer anything more than that look, which was level and unhurried, and gave Garrett room to decide what he thought about it. Garrett did not know what to do with it. He shook Mason's hand because that was the thing to do, and he shook it firmly because he was his father's son, but his eyes were asking questions that he did not ask out loud, and Mason could see those questions and understood them and was not offended by any of them. Garrett went inside with his father. Mason stayed on the porch. He sat on the swing in the evening heat of a Tucson June, and he listened to the sounds of a father and son inside the house, their voices low and broken and necessary, and he drank his iced tea, and he watched the street, and he let them have it. Preacher came around the side of the house and sat on the porch steps. He did not say anything. He just sat there with Mason in the evening, and that was enough. That was always enough with Preacher. Nora's flight landed at 11:47 that night. Mason heard the car in the driveway from the porch where he was sitting. He stood up. He looked through the front window and saw Harold already moving toward the door, moving faster than he had moved all day. Something in his body responding to the sound of his daughter arriving, the way bodies respond to things they have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. Nora came through the front door and Harold took her in his arms, and she made a sound that was not a word and pressed her face against his shoulder. She was 47 years old, with Eleanor's dark hair gone slightly gray at the temples, and Eleanor's way of tilting her head, and she held her father the way women hold people they love when they are frightened and relieved at the same time. Garrett was in the doorway to the kitchen. He had been sitting with Harold for 4 hours talking and not talking in the way that people who have known each other their whole lives can do. And he looked at his sister over their father's shoulder, and something passed between them that did not need words. Mason stayed on the porch. He gave them the house and the night and whatever they needed to do inside it without a stranger present. He sat on the porch swing with the warm June air moving through the maple trees, and Preacher beside him on the steps, and he listened to the sounds of a family finding each other in the middle of the worst thing. After a while, Garrett came to the screen door. He opened it and looked at Mason. He had taken off his jacket and rolled his sleeves up, and he looked like a man who had been crying and was not embarrassed about it. He said, "You want to come inside?" Mason looked at him. "You sure?" "My father asked me to come get you," Garrett said. "So yeah, I'm sure." Mason got up. He folded the vest over his arm and followed Garrett inside. Harold was on the couch with Nora beside him, her hand through his arm, her head against his shoulder. She looked up when Mason came in, and her eyes took him in the same way Garrett's had, the size and the tattoos and the simple fact of him. And then she looked at her father's face, and whatever her father's face said answered the question she had been about to ask. "You're Mason," she said. "Yes, ma'am. He told me about you." She looked at him steadily, the same direct way Eleanor had apparently looked at things. "He said you sat with him." "I did." "He said you stayed." "I did." Nora looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Thank you." 2 words, plain and direct, the way people say things when they mean them entirely and have no interest in dressing them up. Mason nodded once. He sat in the armchair across from the couch, and Harold looked at him, and that was enough. The 4 of them stayed up until past 1 in the morning, the children asking questions and Harold answering them slowly, telling them about the morning, about finding Eleanor, about sitting with her, about driving to Murphy's, because it was the only thing his body knew how to do. He told them about booth number 4. He told them about Mason. He told them about the parking lot and the drive home and the men who came and stood in the front yard all night. Garrett listened to all of it with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded. His face went through several things. When Harold got to the part about Mason stepping between him and the man with the knife, Garrett looked at Mason for a long moment. Mason looked back at him simply. After Harold finished, Garrett said to Mason, "I owe you." Mason shook his head once. "You don't." "My father could have been." "He wasn't," Mason said. "Leave it there." Garrett looked at him. Something settled in his face. He nodded. They slept eventually, all of them, Harold in his bed, and Garrett on the couch, and Nora in the guest room that still had Eleanor's sewing things stacked along one wall, because Eleanor had never quite gotten around to actually using it as a sewing room and had spent 20 years intending to. Mason took the armchair and slept lightly the way he always slept, with one ear on the street, waking twice when cars went past, dropping back when they kept going. Preacher and the other stayed through the night. In the morning, 2 of them were gone, and 2 remained, Diesel and a quiet man named Holt, who nobody talked about much, sitting in the shade of the maples on folding chairs they had produced from somewhere, drinking coffee from a thermos. The Buick did not come back. It did not come back the day after that either. And by the 3rd day, Preacher told Mason that Crow had paid a visit to an address in South Tucson and had made the situation clear to the people inside it in terms that left no room for interpretation, and the matter was settled. Mason told Harold the street was clean. Harold nodded and said he had figured it probably was. The next 3 days were the days of the things you do. There were calls to make and arrangements to confirm, and a funeral home on Grant Road that Harold had already made arrangements with years ago because Eleanor had insisted on it, had sat down with him at the kitchen table one evening in 2019 and said she did not want their children making those decisions in the middle of grief, and so they were going to make them now, while they were capable of being sensible about it. Harold had sat across the table from her and thought she was being morbid and said so. And she had said, Harold, someone has to be practical, and she had been right. And now he was grateful for every decision she had made in that conversation. Mason drove Harold to the funeral home on the first morning. He sat in the waiting room while Harold and Garrett and Nora went in with the director. He sat there for an hour and 15 minutes and read a magazine from 2023 and drank bad coffee from a paper cup and waited. And when they came back out, Harold looked like a man who had put something down that had been very heavy and was still feeling the strange lightness where the weight had been. On the way back, Harold said, "She already picked the flowers." Mason kept his eyes on the road. 12 years ago, Harold said. She already picked what flowers she wanted, white and yellow. She said white and yellow because she didn't want it to be somber. He looked out the window at the Tucson streets going past. That's Eleanor, planning a funeral so nobody would feel sad. Mason said, she sounds like Pearl. Harold looked at him. Pearl planned her own funeral too, Mason said. Down to the music. She wanted a particular hymn played and she wrote it down on a note card and taped it to the inside of her Bible where she knew somebody would find it. He paused. I found it. Played exactly what she asked for. Harold was quiet for a moment. Did it help having something to do for her? Mason thought about it honestly. Yeah, he said. It did. Harold nodded slowly. He looked back out the window. She picked white and yellow, he said again quietly, like he was holding the words somewhere they would stay. Garrett came around in the way that people come around, not all at once, not through any single conversation, but through the accumulation of small things observed and understood. He came downstairs at 6 on the second morning and found Mason in the kitchen making coffee. They said good morning to each other, and Garrett poured a cup and leaned against the counter, and they stood together in the early quiet without talking, and that was not uncomfortable. Eventually, Garrett said, "How long have you been with the Angels?" 22 years. Garrett looked at his coffee. My dad said you lost your grandmother when you were 19. That's right. And there was nobody else? No. Garrett was quiet for a moment. I didn't know, he said then. About my dad, I didn't know he was alone in this house until he called. He looked at Mason. That's going to stay with me for a while. Mason said, he's not the kind of man who asks for help. No, Garrett said, he's not. A pause. He walked into a diner with 2 different shoes on. He did. And you let him sit down with you. He asked, Mason said simply. Garrett looked at him. Most people wouldn't have. Mason did not say anything to that. He drank his coffee. Bev called on the second afternoon. She had heard the way small things travel in a place where people have been going to the same diner for decades, and she called Harold's number, and Harold let it go to voicemail. And Nora saw his face when he listened to it later and asked if he was all right, and he said yes, and then said he needed to sit on the porch for a while. Garrett went out to sit with him. Mason heard them from the kitchen where he was putting dishes away, the rhythm of it. A father and son on a porch swing in the evening heat, the maple trees moving in whatever small breeze came through, neither of them in any hurry. Later that night, Garrett found Mason on the porch alone. He sat down on the steps. He looked at the street for a while before he said anything at the cone of light under the street lamp at the ordinary quiet of Oleander Street. He said, Bev told me what happened. At the diner, all of it. Mason waited. She said my dad walked straight to that booth like he always does and you were sitting in it. Garrett shook his head slightly. She said when he asked to sit with you, the whole diner went quiet. He paused. She said you listened to him for 2 hours. I didn't keep track. She said you ordered Eleanor's food for him. Mason said nothing. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I should have been here. Simply without drama, not looking for anything. Just a man saying a true thing out loud. I knew she was going faster in the last few weeks. I knew it. And I told myself I'd come down next weekend, and then next weekend, and he stopped. I should have been here. Mason looked at the street. You're here now. That's not the same thing. No, Mason said. It's not, but it's what you have. He looked at Garrett. Your father doesn't blame you. You know that. I know he doesn't. Garrett leaned his forearms on his knees. I blame me. Mason looked back at the street. Pearl died alone too, he said. I was in Flagstaff, 20 minutes away moving scrap iron at a junkyard while she sat down in her chair for the last time. He paused. I've had 25 years to make peace with that, and I'm not sure I'm all the way there yet. But I'll tell you what I've learned. He looked at Garrett. The guilt doesn't do anything for her. Not one thing. The only thing that does anything is making sure the people still here know you're not going to let it happen twice. Garrett looked at him for a long moment. She would have liked you, he said finally. Mason looked at him. Eleanor, Garrett said. She had this thing for people who weren't what they appeared to be. She said those were the interesting ones. He almost smiled, and it was his father's almost smile exactly. You're pretty far from what you appear to be. Mason looked back at the street. I hope she would have, he said. I genuinely hope so. The funeral was on a Thursday morning. The church was small white clapboard on the corner of Elm and Madison, 2 miles from Murphy's Diner. It had been there since 1941. Harold and Eleanor had been married in it in June of 1973. Harold had sat in its pews for 53 years of Sundays and had his children baptized in it, and had said goodbye to friends in it, and had watched its congregation grow old and shrink and grow again in cycles the way congregations do, and it was the only place in Tucson that felt right for this. Eleanor's white and yellow flowers were everywhere. The funeral director had followed her instructions precisely, and the result was exactly what she had intended, which was a room that looked like something was beginning rather than something ending. The pews filled with people Harold had known for decades. Neighbors, old colleagues from Briggs construction men in their 70s now, who had swung hammers beside him on 100 job sites, and who stood a little straighter when they shook his hand this morning. Friends of Eleanor's from the library where she had volunteered on Tuesday afternoons for 20 years. A woman named Patricia, who had been Eleanor's closest friend since 1981, and who sat in the front pew and held Harold's hand before the service, and did not let go for a long time, and Harold held on too. Garrett and Nora sat beside Harold in the front pew. On Harold's other side was the empty space that could not be filled, and that everyone in the church was careful not to stare at. In the last pew in the back of the church, 6 men stood. They had left their vests at home. They wore dark button-down shirts tucked in, black slacks. Their hair was combed, their beards were trimmed. Their boots were the same boots, but they were clean. They stood because the pew behind them was full, and because standing felt right, and because none of them had been asked to sit by anyone, and none of them were going to ask. No one had called them. No one had sent an address. Mason had not told them when or where. They had found out the way that information travels within a group of men who pay attention to each other quietly and without needing to be asked twice, and they had come because coming was the obvious thing, and none of them needed it explained. Preacher stood at the end of the row nearest the wall. His gray beard was combed. His hands were folded in front of him. He looked at Eleanor's white and yellow flowers and at the photograph of her on the easel at the front of the church. Eleanor in the garden, somewhere laughing at something off to the left of the frame, caught mid-laugh the way the best photographs catch people. And he stood quietly and paid his respects to a woman he had never met, and whose husband he had stood watch for through a June night on a street in Tucson. Harold saw them when he walked in. He saw them, and he stopped for just a moment one step inside the door, and he looked at the back row at those 6 men in their dark shirts, standing straight and still in the last pew of his wife's church. Garrett put a hand on his shoulder. Harold reached up and covered his son's hand with his own. He stood there for a breath. Then he walked to the front of the church and sat down. The service was quiet and true in the way that services are true when the person at the center of them was genuinely loved and the people speaking about her actually knew her. The pastor had known Eleanor for 20 years, and he spoke about her specifically, not generically, about her laugh and her crossword puzzles done in pen, and her garden and the Tuesday afternoons at the library, and the way she remembered the names of every person she met and asked about them the next time she saw them by name. And it sounded like her, which was the best thing a service could do. Patricia spoke. She talked about Eleanor the way only someone who has known a person for 40 years can, with the specific and irreplaceable detail that comes from actual shared time. The Eleanor who kept a jar of peanut butter in her car for emergencies. The Eleanor who could not watch sad movies but owned every sad movie ever made. The Eleanor who wrote letters by hand and mailed them on actual paper because she believed that handwriting was a form of attention that nothing else could replicate. When Patricia said that last part, several people in the pews nodded because they had received those letters and they knew it was true. Nora spoke briefly and was barely able to finish, and Garrett put his arm around her while she made her way back to her seat. Then Harold stood. He had written something. He had worked on it for 2 evenings at the kitchen table, and it was 3 pages in his handwriting, close and careful. He walked to the front of the church with those 3 pages in his hand, and he looked out at all the faces of people who had known Eleanor, who had been shaped in ways large and small by the fact of knowing her. He looked down at the 3 pages. He folded them. He put them in the inside pocket of his coat. He looked up. "I had something written," he said. "I'm not going to read it. I think Eleanor would have said it was too long anyway." A sound moved through the church, a small sound very close to a laugh, the sound a room makes when something true is said about someone they recognize and miss. Harold looked at the back of the church. He looked at the 6 men standing in the last row. "Eleanor believed that kindness shows up where you least expect it," he said. "She said this her whole life. She said it in a way that made clear she had tested the theory and found it reliable." He paused. "I told her once I thought she was being naive. She told me I was not paying close enough attention." He looked at the back row, at the 6 men who had come uninvited and stood there in the last pew of a church they had never been in before to honor a woman they had never met. She was right. She was right about a great many things, and she was right about that. I have learned in the last 4 days that the biggest hearts do not always come in the packaging you expect. Eleanor knew that already. She knew it the way she knew things, which was quietly and completely, and long before anyone else caught up. He looked out at the whole church then. "She was the best person I have ever known," he said. "She was the best person I will ever know. I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of 53 years of her company. I am not sure I will manage it, but I am going to try because it is the only thing I can think of to do with whatever time I have left that would mean anything at all." He walked back to his seat. Nora took his hand. Garrett put his arm around him. Harold sat between his children and looked at the white and yellow flowers Eleanor had chosen for herself 12 years ago, sitting in the kitchen with him, being practical because someone had to be. And he thought, that's her. That is exactly her right to the end. And he was grateful for every single day of 53 years of it. After the service, Harold stood at the church door for more than an hour. Every person came to him. He shook every hand and accepted every embrace, and said Eleanor's name many times in response to people saying it to him. Patricia held both his hands for a long time and said things that he would not be able to remember word for word later, but that landed somewhere they would stay. The pastor stood nearby with the quiet readiness of a man trained to be present without intruding. The 6 men from the back row waited. They waited until nearly everyone else had gone. Then Preacher walked up to Harold and stood before him and took Harold's hand in both of his and held it for a moment. He said, "She sounded like a remarkable woman, sir." Harold said, she was one of a kind. "The best ones usually are," Preacher said. He held Harold's hand one more moment and then released it. He looked at Harold with the direct, unadorned respect of a man who does not offer what he does not mean. Then he walked out through the church doors into the June morning. The others came through one by one. They each shook Harold's hand. They did not say much. Diesel said she had beautiful flowers. Crow said he was sorry for Harold's loss, and his voice made clear he meant every word of it. Holt just shook Harold's hand and held it for a moment and nodded, and Harold nodded back, and both of them understood it was enough. Mason came last. He stood in front of Harold in the doorway of the church where Harold had stood 53 years ago as a young man in a borrowed suit waiting for Eleanor to come down the aisle. He looked at Harold, and Harold looked at him. Mason took Harold's hand in both of his and held it. "She would have liked you, son," Harold said. "I know she would have." Mason held his hand and did not say anything right away. He looked at Harold for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I hope so." Harold gripped his hand tighter. "I know so," he said. "I know it." Mason drove him home. Garrett and Nora were behind them in the rental car, and they all went back to the house on Oleander Street, and Nora made sandwiches, and they ate at the kitchen table and talked about Eleanor in the way that families talk about the people they love, in the hours after a funeral, in the specific and the small, and sometimes the unexpectedly funny, the stories that are too particular for a church, but too important to go unsaid. Harold laughed twice that afternoon. Real laughs, short and surprised at Eleanor's stories he had heard dozens of times, but that landed differently now. And each time he laughed, he looked a little startled by it, like a man rediscovering a capability he had been unsure he still possessed. Mason sat at the table and ate a sandwich and listened, and occasionally one of them would include him in something, and he received it simply without making more of it than it was. Garrett flew back to Sacramento on Saturday morning. He stood on the front walk with his bag and held his father's face in both hands for a long moment and said he would call every day. And he meant it in the way that people mean things when they have just been reminded what the absence of someone feels like. He shook Mason's hand, and this time there was something in it that had not been there before, a grip that acknowledged something, and Mason returned it the same way. Nora stayed 4 more days. She reorganized Harold's kitchen in a way that Harold spent 3 weeks discovering and mostly approved of. She weeded Eleanor's flower bed along the front walk and watered it and talked to the plants while she did it, which Harold watched from the porch swing without comment, recognizing in it something of Eleanor. She sat with Harold in the evenings, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they sat in the quiet together, which was its own kind of talking. On her last evening, she sat on the porch with Mason while Harold slept. She said, "Will you keep coming by?" Mason said, "If he'll have me." "He'll have you." She looked at Eleanor's flower bed in the last of the evening light, the petunias and marigolds and the climbing roses along the back fence that Harold could never remember the name of, but that Eleanor had told him 100 times. "He doesn't make friends easily. He never did. He and my mother were each other's primary world for 53 years, and that's a lot to come out of." She looked at Mason. "But he sat down with you." "He did." "He doesn't do things like that. He is not a man who goes to strangers." "I know." Nora looked at him for a long moment. "That means something," she said. "I'm not sure yet exactly what it means, but it means something." Nora flew home on Wednesday. Harold drove her to the airport and stood at the departure entrance and held her for a long time, and then he let her go and watched her walk through the doors, and then he stood there in the Arizona morning looking at the place where she had been. Then he got in the Ford and drove to Murphy's. He sat in booth number 4 by himself. Bev came over and did not say anything, just put coffee in front of him and set the cream and sugar between his hands and went quietly away. He sat in the morning light and drank his coffee and looked at the table and at Eleanor's seat across from him and at the window where the sun came in. He sat there for 40 minutes. Then he left a 20 on the table and drove home. The following Saturday at 7:58 in the morning, a motorcycle turned onto Oleander Street and parked in front of Harold's house. Harold heard it from the kitchen where he was standing with his coffee cup, and he set the cup down and went to the front door. Mason came up the front walk in his vest and boots and bandana. He came up the porch steps and looked at Harold through the screen door. "Booth's not going to sit in itself," he said. Harold looked at him for a moment. Then he opened the screen door and stepped out. They drove to Murphy's in the Ford because Harold did not ride motorcycles, and Mason had accepted this without commentary the first time it came up and never raised it again. They parked in the north lot under the awning. They walked through the door and the bell jingled, and Bev looked up from behind the counter, and when she saw them, her whole face changed a wide and real and entirely unguarded smile that she made no effort to reduce. She came around the counter. She put her hand on Harold's arm for just a moment, and Harold covered her hand with his, and nothing needed to be said, and nothing was. They sat in booth number 4. The morning light came through the window at 8:15 and turned everything gold the way it always did for about 40 minutes, which had been Eleanor's favorite 40 minutes of the week for 53 years, and which were now something else as well, something Harold was still figuring out the name of. Harold ordered the mushroom omelet with wheat toast and a small orange juice. Mason ordered eggs and bacon and black coffee. Bev brought the food without being asked to hurry and without lingering. They ate without hurrying. They did not always talk. Sometimes they sat in the morning light and drank their coffee and looked out the window at Elm Street going about its Saturday business. And that was enough, more than enough. Other times, Harold told Mason something he had remembered during the week, something small and specific about Eleanor, a moment from 20 years ago or 40, and Mason listened the way he always listened, with complete attention and no clock running anywhere. Once Mason told Harold about a job he and some of the others had done over in Bisbee, helping a woman rebuild her fence after a storm took it down because her son had called preacher and asked if anyone could help. Harold asked questions about the work, the materials, and the method the way a builder asks questions when he is actually interested, and Mason answered them with the same seriousness. And they talked about construction for 20 minutes, like two men who understood the satisfaction of making something straight and solid that would outlast the weather. They came back every Saturday. It became the rhythm that Harold's week organized itself around. Monday through Friday were the days of ordinary necessities, the groceries and the bills and the doctor, and the quiet, difficult work of learning to live in a house built for two that now held one. Sunday was the cemetery. Saturday was Murphy's and Mason in booth number 4, and the morning light coming through the window at 8:15. Mason drove Harold to the cemetery every Sunday. He pulled the Ford into the lot at the edge of the grounds, and Harold got out and walked across the grass to Eleanor, and Mason stayed in the car. He never offered to come, and Harold never asked him to. That was understood between them without being said the way things are understood between people who have gotten past the need to explain everything. Harold would sit with Eleanor for as long as he needed, sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes closer to an hour. He talked to her. He told her about the week, what he had eaten, who he had spoken to, what the birds at the feeder were doing. He told her about Garrett's kids, about something Nora had said on Sunday's call that had made him laugh. He told her about the construction going up on 5th Street and his professional opinion on the foundation work, which was not favorable. He told her about Mason. He told her about Saturdays at Murphy's, and about the way Mason listened without hurrying anything along, and about the time Bev had brought them a piece of pie they had not ordered because she said she was testing a new recipe and needed honest opinions, which Harold suspected was not the whole truth, but appreciated regardless. He told Eleanor that he believed she would have liked Mason. He said it to her more than once across more than one Sunday. One Sunday in October, 4 months after Eleanor died, Harold stayed longer than usual. He sat by her headstone in the dry October grass, with the afternoon light slanting long and gold across the cemetery, the kind of light that Tucson does in fall that makes everything look like it has been considered carefully before being placed. He had been doing a great deal of thinking that week, about what he was supposed to do now with whatever remained of his time, about what it meant to keep going when the person who had made going worthwhile was gone, about whether that was a choice you made or simply something the body continued doing regardless. He had been thinking about Eleanor specifically, about the way she had moved through the world, not away from things but toward them, curious, unafraid of people, operating always on the assumption that something good might be about to happen, and being right about it often enough to keep the assumption in good standing. He had been wondering, sitting in that house on Oleander Street in the evenings, whether you could learn that at 81, whether it was something that could still be acquired at that age, or whether it was too late for the learning of new things. He sat with her stone in the October light, and he thought about all of that. Then he asked her something. He sat for a while after asking it, and he listened to the dry October wind moving through the grass and the sound of a crow in the tree line at the far edge of the cemetery. And something happened in the air around him that he did not try to explain or examine too closely. Something that felt like a familiar quality of presence. Something that felt like laughter, like someone laughing quietly into a pillow, the way Eleanor had laughed 1,000 winter nights. He sat very still for a moment. Then he stood up slowly. He brushed the dry grass from his pants. He placed his palm flat on top of Eleanor's headstone and stood there with his eyes closed, feeling the warmth the granite had taken in from the afternoon sun. Then he walked back across the grass to the parking lot. He got in the passenger side of the Ford and pulled the door shut. He sat there looking at the dashboard. Mason did not start the car. He looked straight ahead through the windshield at the October afternoon, the long gold light lying across the cemetery grounds, and he waited. After a while, Harold said, "Mason." "Sir?" "I asked her something today." Mason looked at him. Harold's hands were folded in his lap. He was looking at Eleanor's rosary hanging from the rearview mirror, the blue glass beads turning slowly in a current of air from somewhere. "I asked her if she sent you," he said. "If she had something to do with it, that morning at Murphy's, you being in our booth." He paused. "I know how that sounds." Mason was looking at Harold with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Something more careful in it. Something that was paying a different kind of attention. "I think she laughed at me," Harold said. "I think I heard her laugh, son." He said it simply, not asking for agreement or permission, just saying a thing that was true. "She always laughed at me when she thought I had finally caught up to something she had known for a long time." A long silence settled in the car. Mason reached into the inside pocket of his vest. He took out his wallet and opened it and removed the photograph he always kept there. The small one worn at the corners. A small woman with white hair caught mid-laugh at something off to the left of the frame. And beside her, a young man without tattoos and without a beard and without a vest. Just a boy, really 19 years old, grinning the same grin that was still on Mason's face, when something genuinely struck him as worth smiling about. He held it for a moment. Then he leaned forward and set it on the dashboard, propped against the base of the windshield where it would stay. It sat there next to Eleanor's rosary. Pearl in her photograph, small and permanent, present in the car, the way people are present when they have shaped the people who remember them. Harold looked at it. He looked at Pearl's face, at the white hair and the open laugh and the arm around the boy she had raised from 3 years old. He looked at young Mason in the photograph, at the same face as the man beside him, but unmarked before everything that had come after had come after. He looked at Eleanor's rosary, the blue glass beads, the small silver cross catching the October light. He sat there with both of them, Pearl and Eleanor. Two women he had never met, one of whom he had known and loved for 53 years, one of whom he knew only through what she had made of the man sitting beside him. Two women who had done the same essential thing, which was to love someone completely and without reservation until they could not anymore. He nodded slowly. Mason looked straight ahead through the windshield at the long gold October light over the cemetery, at the crow that was still somewhere in the trees at the edge. "Pearl would have liked her too," he said quietly. Harold kept looking at the photograph. "I know she would," he said. "I know it." They sat there in the car for a while, not talking, just sitting with the afternoon and the photographs and the rosary and everything that 4 months had brought them to, which was this two men in an old Ford in a parking lot in October, each of them carrying a loss that did not get smaller with time, but that had somewhere along the way become possible to carry because they were not carrying it alone. Then Mason started the engine. He pulled out of the lot and onto the road and drove toward Oleander Street through the long October light. They did not talk on the way home. They did not need to. The road ran straight through the desert, and the light ran gold across everything. And Harold watched it through the window, the way Eleanor used to watch things, with full attention, like something good might be about to happen, and it would be a shame to miss it. He was 81 years old. He had built 112 houses with his hands over 40 years. He had loved one woman for 53 years, and she had known him better than he had ever known himself, and she had been right about nearly everything he could think of. He did not know what was ahead. He did not know how many Saturdays remained, how many mushroom omelets at booth number 4, how many October afternoons like this one. He did not know, and he was learning slowly, in the way that stubborn men in their 80s learn things not to need to know. What he knew was this. He had walked into a diner in the wrong shoes with his coat buttoned wrong, and he had sat down across from a stranger, and the stranger had turned out to be exactly the person he needed on the worst morning of his life. He did not fully understand how that worked. He suspected Eleanor would have said it was not complicated. He suspected she would have said she had always known that kindness shows up where you least expect it, and that the only thing required on your part is to walk toward it when it appears rather than away from it, and that if you do that, you will find it more often than you think. Because it is more common than people believe, it is just not always wearing recognizable clothes. He suspected she was right. She was right about most things, probably all of them, if he was being honest with himself, which she had always encouraged him to be. The biggest hearts you will ever encounter are not always wearing the kindest clothes. Sometimes they come in on a Harley with a death's head on their back, and cold eyes and a voice like rocks moving in deep water. Sometimes they say nothing for a long time, and then say exactly the right thing. Sometimes they order you the mushroom omelet your wife always had, and sit across from you in the morning light while you eat it and cry. And they do not look away, and they do not hurry you, and they do not ask you to be any different from what you are. And sometimes they save your life with 4 words. Sit down, old-timer.